Hello everyone and welcome back to the final video in this mini series of our Stitch Along Flamingo aimed at beginners. If you've been stitching along, you should be now right at the final stages of completing the Flamingo, which is so exciting, and I really hope that you've enjoyed the process along the way. And if you're new here, welcome. My name is Sarah and I'm an embroidery tutor that trained at the Royal School of Needlework. And this is part of a step-by-step beginner series. And this is the final part. There's 6 parts in total. So if you're interested in joining us and stitching along, then you can head back to the very first video, which I'll link down below. And then you can work through the series in order. In this final video, we'll be learning French knots and fishbone stitch, 2 lovely stitches that will add the finishing touches and final details to bring our piece to life. So let's get started and finish our flamingo together. So we're going to look now at our last 2 stitches to finish off this project, and that is the fishbone, which is worked in this section here and also in here, and then French knots, which we are going to scatter around here, and then we're going to fill the head solidly with French knots as well. Now the fishbone, I'm going to work in this shape here to start off with, and I'm going to work in one colour, and that's going to be 601, and again I'm using 2 strands in the needle. Now, if you're a little bit more advanced, then fishbone is a lovely shape to shade through. So you could shade through all 3 pinks from light at the tip to dark towards the base. And that will help to give you a lovely sort of 3-dimensional perspective. Because this is aimed at beginners, I don't want to complicate or confuse anything. So that's not something I'm going to demonstrate in this video, but perhaps we can cover it in future videos for certain. So this is the shape I'm going to start with, fishbone stitch. And to start off, I'm just take my pencil and I'm going to draw a central line. Now this is going to act as a guide for our stitching. It's not going to be seen because this stitch totally covers the fabric, so we don't have to worry about covering it up. It is there purely as a guide. This is flattened off a little bit here. Obviously that's happened when I've transferred the design, so it's not a particularly beautiful shape. So I'm just going to tweak that a little bit so that looks a little bit nicer. There we are. And with this stitch, we're going to start at the point. So this section here. And I want to create a long stitch on my central design line to begin with. So I'm going to bring the needle up on the design line. And then I'm going to come down at the point. Now, you can see that I'm coming just a little bit down beyond the point, beyond my design line. And that's to exaggerate the point and make sure that that point stays sharp. If I take it down on the design line, I will end up with a slightly sort of rounded appearance to the end. So with any pointed shape, we always want to exaggerate it just a little bit to help maintain that sharpness. Now, if you've done this stitch before, you might notice that I do this a little bit differently from what you might see in books and things like that. It gives the same finish, but I think personally it's actually easier to get a nice, neat, crisp edge. Okay, so I'm going to show you my method. If you know the other method and want to do it in that way, of course you absolutely can do. So I'm going to start by bringing my needle up on one side of my central line, just a little bit above my first stitch that I've created. Pull that through, and then I'm going to take the needle down on the opposite side. So I brought my needle up at the top, I'm now bringing it down at the bottom, and this time, instead of being just next to the central line, I'm going to take my needle down on my outside design line. And you'll notice what I'm doing with my needle is it's running parallel with my design line, and I'm angling it in towards my point. There, like that. So I'm trying to tuck it in close. And my needle at the moment is sitting at about 45 degrees to the fabric, and it's running parallel with the design line. And what that does, it helps to keep a nice crisp, clean, defined edge. It takes a little bit of practice, but it does help massively. Now I'm going to come up on the opposite side, parallel with where I've just brought my needle up. And this time I'm going to take it down on the top design line. And again, my needle's going to run parallel with my design line, and I'm going to angle the needle in, tucking it in nice and close at about 45 degrees. And then we pull that stitch down. So you can see we're making like a little cross over that first long stitch we did. Then I'm going to come up again, just above my central design line. And then I'm going to take the needle down on my bottom design line here, angling it in, tucking it in nice and close. Needles running parallel with my design line, and take it down. Then I bring my needle up parallel with my stitch I've just done, but in the bottom section, close to my design line, but not on it. And then again, take it down on the top of the design line, angling it in towards the previous stitch, tucking it nice and close, needle runs parallel. And then we come down a little bit further. So the gap I'm leaving, when I bring my needle up on the inside, the gap I'm leaving is about a needle's width, about 1 millimetre or so. And then down on the outside. Now this does take a little bit of practice to get a nice clean edge. So again, up parallel, down on the other side. And once the point is completed, I can stop angling my needle quite as much when I take it down. It's only for the first 3 or 4 stitches that I really need to think about angling it. But now I will take it down and just not angle it quite as much. It's still a little bit angled, but it doesn't need to be as much. And what you don't want to do at any point is angle your needle in towards the stitching like that. Okay, because that will give you a nibbled edge. And again, up on the lower half, next to my central design line, parallel with my previous stitch, and down on the top edge. It doesn't matter which side you start from when you come to start this piece, but if you're coming up above the central design line, then you go down on the opposite outside line. You're basically forming lots of little mini crosses, and they're crossing over at the base of the stitch. If you start bringing your needle up too far away at the central point, then you'll end up with gaps in between your stitching. So keep this distance here in the middle where my needle is now. Keep that nice and close. So I'm going to go ahead and work to the bottom, and then I'll show you what to do at the rounded end. So you can see here I have made it to the end of my shape. And for this part, I'm going to bring another stitch on my design line right at the very bottom. So I'm going to repeat what I've been doing. So we've now got to the bottom and filled in that little base bit. So what we're left with now is 2 little sections, one here and one here, which need filling in. So to begin with, I'm going to just fill in one side, and I'm going to bring my needle up almost on my central design line there. And again, it's at the base of my stitching. And I'm just going to come over and do another stitch. And then I've got a tiny little curved bit which needs filling in. So I'm going to come up next to what I've just done here. And I can't cross over this point here because there's nothing to cross over now. I've reached the base, so if I carry on crossing over, I'll extend outside of my design line. So at this point here, we have to just fill in these little sections. And I will be angling my needle out just a little bit from underneath there. And when I take it down, I'm going to, again, tuck it in just a little bit to help create that little curve. Now your shape, depending on the angle of your first stitch, depending on how you've drawn this bit out the bottom, it won't necessarily end and finish as mine is. So I'm now going to come up at the central point again and do the other side. And I'm just using my malure here to help lay these double threads nice and smoothly. And now you can see I've got that little section that needs filling in. And I want to bring my needle up nice and close at the base here. So you will see that these stitches are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can see that I've pretty much covered my design line, but I've lost that sort of curved shape. So I need to add in another stitch to sort of help create that curve. And this stitch will be a slightly smaller stitch again. And there we have our completed fishbone shape. So we're going to look now at our individual French knots, and we're using 2 strands of the 470, and we're going to put French knots on each of these little dots here. Now, typically I might do this freehand and not actually draw these little dots on, but because this is a beginner's piece, I think it's helpful to have these little marks on your fabric. And you can see here, we really don't have anywhere to start off our thread. So I'm actually going to do a little holding stitch on each one of those little spots. So I'm going to take my needle down here with my knot, do a starting stitch here, like that. Keep it as small as possible, so it's going to be covered by our French knot. Another one here. And then I shouldn't need another one. If I pull on that, yep, that's not moving. I can snip that away and then start my French knots. So I'm going to bring my needle up just a little bit below each of my dots, just a fraction, teeny tiny amount. Then I'm going to lay my needle above my thread. So you can see I'm pulling down with my thread here. My needle is laying above. I'm going to go over with my thread and under my needle, and then take my needle down on my little dot that I've drawn on. Okay, so I've wrapped once, and that's key with French knots. You only wrap once. Take the needle down, and you can see I've tensioned that taut around my needle, and I'm going to pull my needle down, but at the same time I'm keeping my finger here close to the base of my thread. Keep that there, and pull all the way through. And there we have our first French knot. We'll come in and we'll do our next one now. So come up a little bit below, lay the needle above, go over and under with the thread. We are wrapping once. Take the needle down, not in the same hole, just a little bit above. Tension the thread. You can see I'm pulling on this thread here. Tension it around the needle. Keep your finger in position to hold everything in place, and then at the same time pull through slowly from the underneath. And there's your next French knot. And this will give you lovely consistent French knots every time. If you want a bigger French knot, all you need to do is add more threads to the needle. So we're using 2 strands here. You could use 3 or 4. You do not want to wrap around more times like that, because then your knot doesn't retain its tension. Okay, it gets all loose and loopy. So always wrap round once, take the needle down just a little bit above, not in the same hole. Tension the thread around the needle. Keep your finger there in place to hold it there and pull through. When you reach the end, because there's nowhere to finish off the thread, you will have to weave it through some of the stitching on the back. Just 2 or 3 times will be enough. And that is how to work a little French knot. So the last thing I want to show you is French knots being filled in the head section here. And I'm going to use 3 strands this time of the 602, only because I want my French knots to be a little bit bigger so it doesn't take quite as long to fill in. The method for doing the French knots is the same, but I just wanted to show you how to work a little section here, how to do the edge and to fill in as well. So when you're working a filled in shape with French knots, I always like to start on the outside of my design line. So I'll work my French knot as previously, so needle above, go over and under once, and then I take my needle down just above where I brought it up, and then tension and pull through. My next one, I'm going to come down and do just a little bit below. So I like to do the outside line first and then come in and fill in the gaps. So just a little bit below, French knot width away, down on the design line again, and pull through. And then again, do the same, come up a little bit below, not too far away because we don't want gaps. Can see we're getting a nice crisp clean line. And then when it comes to working over the edge of the beak stitching, the closed fly, we're just going to encroach a little bit into that stitching. Okay, so we just can share the same hole of that stitching or bring your needle up slightly through. That's okay as well. And that way we won't have any gaps between our fly stitch and our French knots. So you can see I'm coming up right next to it, sharing the same hole. And I'm always coming up slightly further away. And then when I take the needle down, I'm taking it down next to the previous French knot. Now I would work all of the outside edge first, and then I would start filling in, or at the very least, get a section of the outside line worked in first, perhaps maybe half, and then you can start filling in if you want, if you fancy changing it a little bit. So just do another couple more to cover the beak edge, and then we'll do a few in there just to show you how to fill in. So again, the same as I'm doing my outline. What I don't do is I come in and scatter loads in there and then I sort of randomly fill in. I'm quite methodical in how I fill in, so I always come up a little bit further away. And then take my needle down next to the previous French knot. That way we get them nice and close together. And I'm always trying to fill in next to something that I've already done, rather than just scattering randomly, because then you end up with uneven gaps. You might have a really tiny gap that's too small for a French knot, but you still have to put one in, but then it ends up overlapping and sitting on top of the others. So by always working up against French knots that you've already put in, you help to avoid that. And then I've got a little dot here, which actually is a little bit tricky to see. When I get to that dot there, I'm just going to pop in a French knot, same method, and I'm going to do it in 3 strands of the 470. So I'm going to use the green to make a little eye. You can see how this is filling in nicely. I'm not being left with big gaps because I'm doing everything next to, and I'm not being left with overlapping again because I'm doing everything next to. So that is how to work French knots when you are filling a shape. And that's it, your flamingo is now finished. I really hope you've enjoyed this series and you feel proud of what you've created. If you've made it all the way through, you've hopefully learned lots of different new stitches that you can use in your own projects going forward. And of course, I'd absolutely love to see your finished flamingos, so feel free to share your work with me over on Instagram. Just tag me at Well Embroidered. Thank you so much for stitching with me, and I hope to see you all again very soon in our next video. Bye!